Special election week coverage, KTAR News, on air, online, on the KTAR News app. Tomorrow, join us for all-day election coverage, live and local, and we'll be not only on air, online, on the KTAR News app, but I believe we're streaming a bunch of tomorrow's programming on the Tube, Joe.
We will be kicking it off.
The YouTube. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're looking forward to that. Joining us from ABC News, their political analyst, Steve Roberts. And Steve, always great to have you on. I was curious about your take. We were discussing polls here a moment ago. Florida isn't the swing state that it was 2+ decades ago. But Pennsylvania looks like it's going to be the keystone state. That's a joke, I keep telling. Is that the case? Is Pennsylvania the new Florida, Steve Roberts?
Yeah, it is. That's well said. And you can tell that both campaigns believe that, too. Kamala Harris has spent her entire day in Pennsylvania. She hadn't gone anywhere else. And if you go back to Saturday Night Live skit on Saturday night when Kamala Harris did a cameo on SNL, and she was talking to Maya Rudolph, the actor who plays her on the show. And Harris turns to Rudolph and said, "You don't vote in Pennsylvania, do you?" So it was, and Trump, of course, had made one stop in Pennsylvania as well. And the analogy to Florida is potentially pretty accurate. But let's remember why Florida became such a key state 24 years ago. First of all, it was winner take all. Whoever won that state won the presidency. Secondly, it was enormously close. 537 votes separated the two candidates, Gore and Bush, out of almost 6 million. Wow. 537 out of almost 6 million. Mm-hmm. So, but the differences, in some ways, are even more telling. Today, you have the Internet. You have endless conspiracy theories rocketing around the Internet. You have had years of Donald Trump saying to voters that the only way he could lose is for the other side to cheat. And you have both sides portraying this election as the apocalypse, that if the other side wins, democracy's in peril and America is doomed. And so the stakes are much higher. Nobody thought in 2000, if Al Gore wins or George Bush wins, it's the end of democracy as we know it, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't anything like that same exaggerated sense of how important this is. So that means emotions are so much higher. And it also means that because 24 years later, people have been preparing for something like this for a long time. There are squads of lawyers. I'm sure right there in Arizona, there are an enormous number of people, lawyers, election monitors of different kinds, poised to go to the polls, poised to challenge votes, poised to make a fuss if they see anything that seems amiss. So the stakes are far higher than they were 24 years ago.
Hey, Steve Roberts, our ABC News political analyst in D.C., you made mention of the lawsuits and all the lawyers. It seems like when the election is close, lawyers stand to make a boatload of money. Who's paying for these lawyers? Who's doing that? Where does that come from?
I assume it's coming out of the campaign funds to start with. Or, maybe they go out and raise money. You got to remember that in Florida, it took a full month, actually even a little more than a month, between Election Day and the Supreme Court finally settling that race in favor of President Bush. So, that's enough time to raise money. And you can raise money pretty quickly if you say, the world is coming to an end, send money.
Yeah, that's true.
ABC News political analyst Steve Roberts joins us from Washington, D.C. Steve, with the polls tightening there in Pennsylvania, you mentioned that you expect some litigation. What would that scenario look like? What happens if Pennsylvania is within 1,000 votes, similar to how Florida was back in 2000 for Bush v. Gore?
Well, my best guess would be that both sides are going to be looking for any hint of irregularity. And look, in every election, there are always some glitches. This is never a perfect process, right? But most of the time it doesn't matter because most of the time elections are fairly decisive. So, 100 votes one way or another, who cares? But if it's as close as it could be, you're going to have people challenging votes in different ways. And that could be in the courts. It could be other procedures that have been set up to challenge votes. it could be a real mess. And it can get very angry, and because the stakes are so high. Now, in addition to, and it's also true that the polls show that while Harris seems to be broadening her lead nationally, the New York Times poll out this morning, the ABC poll this morning, said she had a 3-point lead nationally. But in Pennsylvania, it was virtually tied. And the other factor to keep your eye on that helps Trump, the most important number in that ABC poll, in my view, is 74. That's the percentage of Americans who say the country's headed in the wrong direction. And from the very beginning of this election cycle, with all of the turmoil, with all the twists and turns, and Biden pulling out and Harris stepping in and Trump getting shot, the basic structure of this election has not really changed very much. And the most important fact from beginning to end has been the number of Americans in Arizona and everywhere else who say they're unhappy with prices. They're unhappy with inflation. They're unhappy in a larger sense with the hangover from the COVID years. And when 74% of the country says the country's headed in the wrong direction, you want to be the change candidate. And it's very, very difficult to be an incumbent vice president and be a candidate for change. And that is the single most important fact in this election.
Steve Roberts from ABC News joins Chris and I. And Steve, we've been talking a lot about the polls the last few weeks, the last few months, because we don't have the Election Day poll in front of us yet. But over the weekend, Des Moines Register Mediacom poll from Iowa showed Vice President Harris actually leading over former President Trump in Iowa by a few percent. How credible do you find all of these different polls to be? And that one specifically from over the weekend, do you actually think that Iowa could be in play for Harris?
I doubt it. You know, that's why we look at averages of dozens of national polls, because any one poll can be an outlier. Now, the woman who runs that poll is a very well-respected professional pollster. And she pointed out that in her 2 previous polls in the 2 previous elections, she accurately documented Trump's lead in Iowa. So it's not as if she has a record of favoring Democrats or somehow skewing her models in any way. And you got to the one thing that you got to remember that this year, in some ways, one of the most interesting developments is how significant education has become as a variable for determining or indicating how people are likely to vote. Historically, the Democrats were the party of the little guy, the working man. The Republicans were the country club, Wall Street rich set. That's flipped on its head. And today, the more educated someone is, the more likely they are to vote Democratic. Iowa is the most educated state in the country. It has the highest literacy rate of any state in the country. So if, in fact, that poll has some validity, that's what you have to look for as the explanation, is the education level of people in Iowa. I would add one other thing, that I mentioned a number of issues that I think are working for Trump, but there's one that's very important to keep your eye on, for your listeners to keep your eye on, and that's the percentage of people who vote who are women. Historically, there's been a gender gap now in this country for 50 years. And in most years, about 52% of the electorate's been women, about 48% men. It's now creeping up. This year, it could be 53.5% of the electorate are women. And given the fact that Harris is running so strongly with women voters, that's a figure to keep your eye on, because if she can maximize the number of women who turn out, that's a big plus for her.
Steve Roberts, ABC News political analyst in Washington, D.C. Steve, Chris, and I will be watching all of this. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Anytime. I'll be on election night with the ABC coverage tomorrow night. And if I can help you guys out, you let me know.
Sure will.
We will. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching The Chris and Joe Show. Click to see more from Chris and Joe and tap the button in the middle to subscribe to KTAR News.